Now let's go a little north and focus on China. A top Chinese scientist has made a shocking statement. He was asked about the origin of the Wuhan virus, about whether the pandemic could have started due to a lab leak. He said, and let me quote, "You can always suspect anything. That's science. Don't rule out anything." The scientist was Professor George Gao. He was the head of China's Center for Disease Control. Yes, the head of China's CDC says don't rule anything out. And apparently, the Chinese government did not. Gao says that Beijing investigated the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the possible birthplace of the Wuhan virus. It shows that Beijing was worried about the pandemic coming from a lab, despite the staunch denials to the world. So is the Chinese scientist actually going against the government by saying all this? Here's more in our report.
The Wuhan virus, a disease that led to millions of deaths. One that locked down the world. It's no longer considered a public health emergency. The world has long since opened up. But questions remain. What caused the deadly pandemic? More specifically, was the Wuhan virus a natural occurrence? Or was it engineered in a lab? Recently, more fuel was added to this burning question from an unlikely source. A top Chinese scientist, and not just any scientist, the former head of China's Center for Disease Control, Professor George Gao. When asked about the possibility of the lab leak theory being true, Gao said this: "Don't rule anything out." It's an unexpected response, to say the least. Remember, the Chinese government has vehemently denied the lab leak theory. Beijing said it's nothing but slander. But Gao, a former government scientist, is telling us not to rule anything out. Has he decided to speak out, to defy Beijing? Not really. He just said, don't rule anything out. He hasn't really endorsed the theory. But he went on to say China was vigilant, that the government actually conducted an investigation into the lab under scrutiny. This is the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Gao says the lab was double-checked by the experts in the field. He added, "I think their conclusion is that they're following all the protocols. They haven't found any wrongdoings." If that's the case, why tell people not to rule anything out? Is it a criticism of the government investigation? Again, probably not. He said, "You can always suspect anything. That's science. Don't rule out anything." He was talking about scientific rigor, the need for scientists to always question everything. It really proves nothing. Previous assessments say the lab leak theory is extremely unlikely and that the virus originated in a wet market in Wuhan. Of course, this is based on questionable evidence. Even the WHO didn't end up accepting their conclusions. It wants to conduct another probe that digs deeper into the early days of the pandemic in Wuhan. But China refuses to cooperate. So due to lack of other evidence, the wet market theory is the dominant one. But the wet market hypothesis isn't too much better. Remember, these markets are where all manner of animals are kept for purchase. They stacked up in unhygienic conditions, creating a toxic environment where the disease could have been born, jumping from a bat to an intermediate animal and then a human. It's the most widely accepted theory, but again, it's based on limited evidence. It can be wrong. To quote Professor Gao, don't rule anything out. But this advice has its limits, and we should be wary of its misuse. Reports say the Chinese government has come out with a third theory on origins of the Wuhan virus, a theory which takes Wuhan out of the equation. China is saying the virus was brought into the country on frozen food packaging. Yes, Beijing is passing the buck, metaphorically washing its hands off the virus. And if we were to listen to Gao's advice, we would have to consider Beijing's version to not rule it out. That sounds a bit too convenient. An unnecessary nod to an unsubstantiated theory. There's no need to believe everything Beijing says. Here, both the origin theory camps agree. No matter where in Wuhan the virus originated, it did come from the city. We can safely continue calling it the Wuhan virus.